our relationship to nature is so overlaid with assumptions and distinctions that we take to be natural or given by the external world, but are in fact, I think, an artifact of our own construction. And indeed, the very idea that we think about of nature as the natural versus the man-made or the human-made is a distinction that doesn't really arise in cultural discourse until about the late 18th century. And I think it arises in response to the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, people saw the natural world as a source of threat. People built houses with thick walls and small windows to avoid intrusion from wild animals or other people in society. I mean, they were scared of nature. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, we came to see the urban setting, the industrial setting, as a source of threat, and nature as benevolent.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded on Treaty 6 territory. Now, the episode you're about to listen to was really challenging for me because it challenged my concept of nature and my relationship with it, which was really cool. I was contacted by a gentleman named Martin Bunzl. He is a professor of philosophy emeritus at Rutgers University. He spent the last 40 years of his life thinking about philosophy, and he wrote a book called Thinking While Walking, Reflections on the Pacific Crest Trail. And in it, he challenges our ideas of nature and our relationship with nature and kind of tries to force us to challenge our own assumptions. And he just wants us to challenge our own preconceived notions. And I like that idea because it forced me out of my comfort zone into a place where I've never had to question my reality like that, right? My entire career is based around nature and our relationship with it. And in this book, Martin forced me to just challenge all of that. It was good. I liked it because I think it made me better in the end. It made me, when I came out of this book, I think I had a more skeptical mindset and definitely a more comprehensive perspective, I think, on relationship and ourselves. And so I hope you guys like it. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was incredible. We really got to dig deep into Martin's personal reasons for wanting to discover these things and his conclusions at the end of the book. And yeah, philosophy is a weird one, man. It really baffles the mind. Wes Fraser is the #1 sponsor for 2021. Without them, this would not be possible. I just want to thank Wes Fraser for all of their support. It's been great, and they allow me to do this the way I want it, which is, you can't ask for more than that. Greenlink Forestry is also a sponsor, been with me since the beginning. Thank you, Greenlink, for all of your support. It's been such a great ride. And also Damaged Timber is also a sponsor. They are a company out of Edmonton, Alberta, selling damaged timber. They go out into the bush, into wildfire burn areas, cut down that tree, bring it back to the shop, cut it into butcher blocks, and put it in your kitchen. It's awesome. You can have wildfire burnt trees, wildfire burnt nature in your kitchen. It's very cool. Check them out. Your Forest Tenant checkout to get 10% off. That's damagedtimber.com. So without any further messing around, let's dive into this really cool conversation with Martin, really challenging conversation with Martin about our relationship to nature and why we should challenge our assumptions. Here we go. I'd like to start off getting to know you a little bit, getting to know your why. Why did you get into, like in your case, philosophy, and more specifically, why did the philosophy of nature interest you?
I taught philosophy at Rutgers University for 40 years, and that's the only place that employed me after I got my PhD from the University of Minnesota.
Right.
I began with an academic interest in the social sciences, but it turned out the questions I was asking were always foundational questions, the most basic questions in the discipline. And from there, I discovered philosophy of science, which was my specialization and is my specialization, which really asks foundational questions about science. I worked for most of my career on relatively esoteric subjects like what's a law of nature as opposed to an accidental generalization? What's the difference between causation and correlation? And I spent a lot of time thinking about something that I think is central to science, but we don't understand, which is counterfactual reasoning, asking how things would have been different if what came before had been different. Okay. But in about 2008, I started getting serious about climate change. I'd actually decided not to have children because of fear of nuclear destruction between the Soviet Union and the United States. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, I sort of relaxed and did have 2 children. And then I started worrying about climate change when thinking about my grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And I've been preoccupied with climate change from about 2008 until today, initially coming at it from the angle of a philosopher of science. And that means I was mainly looking at the calculus of risk and how to understand risk. And what's interesting about risk when it comes to climate change, as well as interventions in climate change, is that these fall into a pretty esoteric class of risk factors in that they have the potential to be catastrophic, literally catastrophic, mm-hmm. in that they can cause extinction of species, including potentially our own species. And the probability of that is small. But even though the probability of it is small, the consequences of extinction are very large. Mm-hmm. And we don't have a good way of analyzing risk when it comes to these kind of catastrophic outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. In the beginning that you're talking about when you were in your other degrees and you were learning that the questions you were asking were the most fundamental. It's an interesting insight because that's kind of what I've gathered is this is, like I said, this is kind of my baptism in philosophy, was reading your book and then having this conversation. So it's all very new to me. But although the questions that you ask in this book, the philosophical questions, are very in-depth and very specific and very difficult to comprehend in the sense that you have to really wrap your mind around things that we take for granted or things that we just assume to be real. It's interesting that philosophy is that. It's a deeper dive into the most basic. It's an interesting way of putting it.
Well, I don't want you to scare your listeners. The book is written for a general audience and it's non-technical. And I think that you're making it sound, I hope, more intimidating than it really is. But your last comment is correct. I'm very partial to a quote by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who talks about the goal of philosophy as the substitution of articulate hesitation for inarticulate certainty. And that's my credo. My credo is to get people to stop and think what they are assuming and taking for granted and see that things are more complicated than they assumed. It's not that they may not arrive at the same conclusion, but the route to that conclusion may be a lot more complicated than they think. And nowhere is that more true when it comes to climate change specifically and your field or ecology more generally. I mean, these are immensely complicated topics, and we should be hesitant to be so certain about what we believe. When it comes to climate change, most of our predictions are very iffy. But I like to tell people, because your doctor tells you smoking may cause cancer, but he or she is not sure it will, is not a reason to smoke. There are reasons to be cautious in the face of uncertainty.
That's a good point. I like that. That's excellent. No, and to speak to your first point is I don't mean to say the book is complicated. More the book is it's very in depth in that because I said, like I said, this is my first kind of baptism or first attempt at understanding philosophy. I find I had to shift the way my brain worked, and just not difficult. Didn't take very long. Just I had to, like you said, question all the things that I came to assume to be true, which is it's a different way. Like, not for you, that this has been your entire life, your entire career, but I can tell you for someone like myself, it is definitely a different way of thinking. But I found it very valuable, in that I did find myself throughout the book questioning a lot of these things, to the point where it was almost like I would start a question, and that question would lead to another question, which would lead to another question, which would lead to 30 or 40 more questions. And
Excellent.
by the end of it, I found myself so baffled by the complexity that the original questions seemed to have lost all meaning.
No,
not in a negative way. I just mean that, like, it provided me an opportunity to think about it to really challenge my own perspective, and I liked it. It's a good thing.
That's great. Then it worked for you. That's the goal.
It did. Okay. So along those lines, I want to start off pretty basically, and I want you to help me and for my listeners to conceptualize the value of philosophy, and like why it's important. What does it provide to society that would otherwise be missed?
Well, I think, to go back to the quote that I gave you, from Bertrand Russell, I think philosophy promotes the idea that what we take for granted is more open to question than we think. And in the context of our present debates, my goal is to see people avoid forming one side versus another, each cocksure about his or her position and going at it. I want discourse to be informed by a level of mutual uncertainty, which I think can allow us to arrive at a more productive consensus about the policy questions we face. And again, nowhere is that more true than when it comes to climate change. I think so much of what informs our discourse begins with assumptions that are never examined, and then we're off to the races with incompatible assumptions that each side takes, which they're not willing to open to question.
That was an interesting point. You said a mutual uncertainty.
Yes,
that was the phrase you used, the mutual uncertainty. That is a very interesting phrasing, because like you said, with the advent of the internet and the advent of politics the way it is today, it is all of these people who are totally cocksure of their position, and I am right and you are wrong, and screw you for thinking otherwise, and you're evil if you don't think what I think. And that a concept of mutual uncertainty I love, because it just brings everyone to the table as equals and be like, hey, like let's not come at this from a I have to be right or this is all stupid. Let's come at this from a point of, hey, what is the right answer? And let's sort this out together and not have judgment. I like that. Yeah, mutual uncertainty is, I don't know why I'm holding on to that phrase. I think I'll use that.
Okay.
Yeah, in this day and age, right? Where
right.
That's what you want to see is cooperation and people of different perspectives coming to a table and being able to sort something out that is otherwise beyond both of them individually.
Right.
Yeah. So diving more into this book, you wrote this book, Thinking While Walking, and it was about the Pacific Crest Trail. So correct me if I'm wrong. Did you walk the entire trail, or were you?
No, I did. Okay. No, I did not. And I make that. I fess up to that in the introduction to the book. I make a distinction in the book between hiking and strolling.
Yes.
And strolling is something I love to do, and I talk about its relationship to creative thinking, as opposed to hiking, which has a kind of relentless quality and that I think to some extent dulls the mind. I've strolled or walked about 9 sections of the Pacific Crest Trail, starting here where I live in Southern California by the Mexican border, and ending up in the Northern Cascades, about 60 miles south of the border, which goes over to Manning State Park in Canada. And each section is each section is a chapter, and each chapter is on a particular topic that in varying degrees is tied to the location I'm hiking in. Sometimes I started hiking with an idea of what I wanted to think about. Sometimes I started hiking and something caught my imagination and I started thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. It takes an incredible amount of focus to be able to stay on one subject while strolling. At least I've found that.
Well,
I suppose if you set yourself to the task, you kind of,
yeah. I mean, I'm paid to focus on a subject. So
there you go. Yeah, that's a good
some of the
motivation.
things I've written about, I focused on for 30 years. So
right, yeah. No, it's an interesting. That was one of the first things that caught me too. Was exactly that point, the differentiation you made between hiking and strolling, and that hiking is almost mindless, and you kind of succumb to the idea of this grind, and that I have to complete this hike so that I can relax at the end and enjoy the fact that I did this hike. Whereas strolling allows the mind to wander more and be more creative and be more in nature. Right?
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, I think a lot of people hike the Pacific Crest Trail with a personal goal in mind, or a personal crisis that they want to overcome, or embrace the challenge for personal reasons. And I think that's okay if people want to do that. Although I do sometimes think there are more socially useful ways to embrace a personal challenge. But I do think that it's harder to engage with nature given the challenge itself, which is an overwhelmingly difficult physical challenge.
Yeah, no kidding. It's, what did you say, 2,600 miles, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of miles.
And you only have a window of at most 4 months, because you've got, desert heat down here in the south, and then you've got the snows that start in the north. So you don't have, you have a limited amount of time to do it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there would have been a benefit towards you walking the whole thing, or do you think it would have taken away from your ability to write this book?
Well, I'm 72 years old and my right knee is gone, so I don't think that would have been a particularly productive exercise.
Okay, there you go. That's the answer. That's kind of what I assumed. I assumed you spent 40 years in university. You're probably not as spry as you once were, right? Oh no, it almost seems like it's an interesting quest to try and hike that entire thing, because it's just, I mean, yeah, you need 3 or 4 months to accomplish it, and you're going to lose any kind of excess weight that you could possibly have. You're going to be working off just the bare bones. So I can't imagine it allows a lot for cognitive ability.
Correct.
So tackling, again, getting back to this concept of the chapters that really intrigued me about your book were the ones that were specifically tackling, I mean, they all were, but were specifically tackling our perspective of nature and our relationship to it in the grander scheme. And so to me, it almost seems like nature is like the philosophical holy grail of things to consider, because it forces us to consider, I mean, ourselves within it and our consciousness and all these kind of things. And maybe that's true of all philosophical arguments once you get down to the bottom of them. But I found it to be, incredibly enriching. And it was, I wanted to know, did you think that the philosophy of nature, like, what do you hope to accomplish by getting people to think about those things? Like you mentioned talking about getting them to question their assumptions, but what will that serve to accomplish, do you think?
Well, I think the philosophy of nature is a relatively neglected subject, in part because nature itself is such a wide and complicated subject. And I think that modern philosophy tends to focus on relatively specific, easy to articulate things to think about. So we think about, what is a law of nature, or what is a species, or what is art, or what does it mean to engage in a just action. But to talk about nature as a whole, as opposed to, let's say, an academic discipline like physics, is a very broad subject. And so I think it's been neglected by philosophers of my kind. I'm an analytic philosopher. I tend to analyze things. And so I think that's a challenge in itself. But the other thing is, I think that our relationship to nature is so overlaid with assumptions and distinctions that we take to be natural or given by the external world, but are in fact, I think, an artifact of our own construction. Indeed, the very idea that we think about of nature as the natural versus the man-made or the human-made is a distinction that doesn't really arise in cultural discourse until about the late 18th century. And I think it arises in response to the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, people saw the natural world as a source of threat. People built houses with thick walls and small windows to avoid intrusion from wild animals or other people in society. I mean, they were scared of nature. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, we came to see the urban setting, the industrial setting, as a source of threat, and nature as benevolent. The German writer von Humboldt started writing about this, and he had a great deal of influence on North American writers like Thoreau and John Muir. But this idea of nature as benevolent and natural versus the human-made as being technical, unnatural, and by implication bad, sets up a binary opposition that influences a lot of the way we think, and that especially is true in climate change. We have, if I think of your field, forestry, I think we have a romantic view of forests and trees, and we have a condemnatory view of technological developments like engineered crops or mechanical efforts to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I think this kind of binary between what we think of as the natural and the good versus the man-made and the bad distorts the way we think about the challenges we face today, not only with regard to climate, but with regard to the natural world in general.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's the sense that I get throughout the entire book, was like trying to sort out that dichotomy that we've created for ourselves between nature, the natural being good and benevolent and right, and then the man-made being bad and evil and seeking monetary success and that kind of thing, and to try and I think you do a good job of merging these two in a way to try and make us understand. And I mean, there's the basic argument that I think anyone in environmental sciences has considered, is that like we are ourselves part of nature, but you go so much more in depth into breaking down those barriers of where do we draw the line between nature and man-made, and why would we draw the line between nature and man-made? What does that serve to accomplish, really?
Yes, when you say, you correctly say, in environmental science, we think of us as part of nature. And in one sense, of course, everything that we do is therefore part of nature, including the plastic we dump in the oceans. But this image of nature as pure is an image that puts us outside nature. And nothing exemplifies that to me more than the fact that when John Muir established the Yosemite Park, he organized the expulsion of the indigenous people that were living there because he wanted people to experience the park without human beings in it. And I think that's poignant and emblematic of the idea of the way in which we construct natural spaces, Yosemite being the primary one, for us to experience nature. But it's a very curated notion of nature. It takes a lot of human work behind the scenes to cultivate it and keep it the way we wanted to see it, especially in the light of change taking place. And one of the themes in the book is this idea of freezing nature is profoundly unnatural. It goes against the central tenet of nature, which Darwin established for us, which is natural selection involves continuous change. And what we're trying to do in places like Yosemite or in Britain in the Lake District area, and I don't know, I'm sure there are places like it in Canada as well, is we're trying to freeze nature and resist the change that is taking place. Not only change produced by us and our action, but change through natural processes.
Yeah, I really appreciated your insight into that, because As someone that's maybe not directly in the environmental sciences world, I wasn't sure what your perspective would be on like Indigenous people's relationship to nature and how that impacts our relationship to nature. And I've done a whole series called Good Fire with a woman named Amy Cardinal Christensen talking about cultural burning from Indigenous peoples, right? And exactly the thing you were talking about, how Indigenous folks were kicked out of parks by John Muir, and the same thing happened in Canada when we created the national parks. That they were kicked out and told they can't operate, and then we suppressed fire and we suppressed anything. And I liked the idea of curating and the idea of constructing nature. Like that's what we've done in these parks. It's not a real representation of nature. It's
exactly
what we've decided we want nature to be.
Exactly. But also at the same time, I think this is controversial. We romanticize Indigenous people as well. There's a section in the book in which I talk about North America before the arrival of Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
And the Indigenous people of the time had run all of the large mammals into extinction by overhunting. And there's a map in the book of burn areas prior to the arrival of Columbus. One of the things people don't know, on the eastern area of the United States, Indigenous people engaged in settled agriculture. They weren't just hunters and gatherers, and they used widespread burning to clear the land.
That's
if you look at that map in the book, about 2/3 of the eastern area of the United States, from the seaboard to about the middle of the Middle West, was regularly burnt to clear forest land. So it's not just what you might call, what you just referred to as healthy burning. It's widespread burning to transform the natural world for agricultural purposes. So there were really two transformations of North America that occurred, one by the Indigenous people and the other by the arrival of the white man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that podcast series, the Good Fire series, we talk about that, how this is not, it was used as not as like hazard reduction, like it was used for hazard reduction in some sense, but it was used culturally and also for sustainable reasons, as far as, you know, producing better berry crops or creating more moose habitats, so for better hunting. And it was used as a means to, like you said, curate nature in a way that allows them to survive and flourish better, right? And so, there's that concept of, you know, everything was natural until the white man came, but it depends on how you define natural, right? Like I don't personally, I reject the notion that nature needs to be without man. I think that's a very simplistic, romantic view and problematic in and of itself, right? As you said, Indigenous people have been here, you know, since the Ice Age, and there's some evidence in South America for 40,000 years that they've been there, and they've been managing the landscape since then. And what's the difference between them managing the landscape and us managing the landscape? And you could argue that they're culturally more in tune, but there's an interesting divide there, right?
Well, yes, I think that's correct. And I think a lot of these categories, like the natural, are open to question. I have a section in which I talk about indigenous versus invasive plants, and I think that's a problematic notion. I mean, it's conceptually problematic. You know, what's the notion of an indigenous plants on the Hawaiian Islands, all of which were populated by technically invasive plants from coming across the ocean one way or another? Yeah. But I also think that you're quite correct. We've been transforming the quote natural space for over at least 12,500 years, which is when settled agriculture started. And our concept of nature is very shaped by our experience of what we grow up in. I mean, I grew up in England and used to go to the Lake District. The Lake District was the first tourist area in the late 18th century for the new middle class that was getting wealthy from the Industrial Revolution. The Lake District had become barren through sheep grazing, first timbering and then sheep grazing. But our picture of beautiful English countryside is one of these barren hills. And in fact, even today, the Lake District is managed to make sure trees don't come back to distort from that image that people think of as natural and beautiful.
More curated, yep. Yeah. It is interesting when you start to dive deep into these concepts, because it becomes harder and harder to divide our own actions from those that are traditionally considered natural.
Yes, I think that's very well put.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And I struggle with trying to. I think the whole thing. I guess when I was finished the book, I was trying to answer a question in my mind as to how do we decide what we should and shouldn't do if we are a part of nature and all this kind of thing, and trying to dissect where to draw the lines. Because I mean, you have organizations that are, NGOs that are all about creating more parks and creating more places where humans shouldn't be, or we shouldn't have any kind of activity or burning or anything. And then you have organizations that also think that we should have a more mutualistic and engaged activity on the landscape and be more involved so that we can actively manage species and curate it the way we want it to be. And somewhere in between those two things, well, then there's a third option of people who just don't care and want the money and are going to extract and pull. But I'm not sure how common that is. But somewhere in between there is what I would consider foolishly probably the right answer.
Well, I think you introduced this by using the question, what should we do? And I think one of the challenges in this area is whether or not there is a notion of should that applies to nature. We can talk about what we should do from an anthropocentric point of view, from the point of view of human interest. And if you try and extend beyond that and say, what should we do relative to nature, relative to animals, you're into the terrain of treating nature and treating animals as things that have moral standing, that are part of moral discourse. And I think that's highly problematic. I don't think nature has interests. I don't think nature as a collective cares whether things exist or not. I mean, that's the lesson of natural selection. Sure. And I think people have an incredibly romantic attitude towards the notion of animal rights. And I say that as a vegetarian. I think it's very, very difficult to generate an argument that at least most animals have the kind of cognitive capacity that would make it reasonable to think of them as having what we call moral interest, a moral point of view. And I think when people are promiscuous in ascribing moral rights to whole categories of species, I think they miss one very important point about ethical reasoning. I think the whole point about ethical reasoning is that if you have ethical standing, then you deserve equal treatment to everything else that has ethical standing. In other words, if we have a group of things that we say, these are all moral beings, then we are assuming certain constraints on how we should treat them. And one thing I don't think that moral reasoning allows is two classes of moral beings, sort of first-class moral standing and then second-class moral standing. So if you think cows have moral rights, I think moral discourse dictates that they have the same rights as you do. And most people who are, as I say, promiscuous in ascribing moral rights are not willing to follow through on the consequences of that. I think the fundamental problem, setting aside morality, is that even from an anthropocentric point of view, from our point of view, there are just too many of us as a species. In current technology, the carrying capacity of the world without disastrous consequences is about 3.5 billion people. Now, technology may mean that goes up, but really the source of most of our problems, our climate problems, our problems in relationship to disrupting nature, let's call it disrupting nature, is that our numbers are so large.
Yeah.
And to me, a central problem of the challenge of climate change is that I think there's overwhelming evidence that fertility, the size of the number of children people have, is inversely related to economic well-being.
Yeah.
And in order for the 6.5 billion people in the world who are in varying degrees of poverty to reach an economic level where lowered fertility kicks in, you need to increase economic wealth. And the reality is you can't increase economic wealth without increasing energy. Most of the demand over the next 40 years for energy is not going to come from people in Canada and the United States. We're energy pigs. Well, we in the United States are more pigs than you guys are, but relative to the world, we're energy pigs, and it's easy for us to change our behavior and cut back on energy. But for most people in the world, their energy budget is minuscule compared to us, and they have legitimate reasons to want more energy for basic things like refrigerators, electric bicycles, and this and that. And in order for them to have that, to grow their household income, which would lead to fewer children, we need more energy. And this is where I think magical thinking comes in the climate debate. People always assume, oh, if we wanted to, we could just have as much renewable energy as we wanted. But it takes decades to transition an economy. Only 20% of energy globally is non-fossil fuel, and that includes nuclear energy. Energy demand is going to grow, as I said, by about 40% in the next 30 years, 75% which will be from the developing world. It's unrealistic to think that we can transition to a fully fossil-free economy in less than 50 to 75 years. And then the question comes, what about the energy demand of the developing world in that period? And what about the knock-on consequences of that relative to population? I'll say one more thing. United Nations population projections based on the current state of the economy of the world, especially Africa, is somewhere between 10 and 15 billion people by the end of the century. That has enormous implications.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I think it's pretty well documented that the more well off economically and the more educated, the less children you have, and that has positive implications for climate change, like you said, and we are climbing out of that hole, but it's going to take who God knows how long to get to that point. And like you said, in the meantime, we could lose everything. So just for the sake of argument, because you posed a lot of questions there. You have a magic wand. You're the king of the world. What do you do? Do you implement a black dot policy, or what do we do about this?
Well, yeah. If I'm really Machiavellian, I put birth control in the water.
Yeah, just remove people's rights to choice. No problem.
Or if I'm able to be a left-wing libertarian, I say every person in the world has a right to have one child, and if you don't want that, you can sell that to someone who wants two children. And in one generation, we do it with you. You have a right to half a child. You can have a child with one other person. Two of you can have a child together. Then in one generation, we cut the population from 7.8 to the carrying capacity of 3.75 or whatever it is, and then everyone can have one child from then on. I don't know.
Some moral problems with that.
Yeah, well, this is another case in which I think we are liberal about things. People say, "Oh, we could just plant trees and that would solve the problem because it would absorb the carbon dioxide." Well, you're the forester here. I don't have to tell you trees fall over and die, and then the wood rots and releases all of the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The deciduous trees drop their leaves every year, and those leaves rot, and about half the carbon dioxide they've absorbed is re-released to the atmosphere. In order to, even if you reforested all of North America and kicked everyone out, you would only begin to nudge a little bit into the problem of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's no simple natural solution to solving our problem without, I think, magical thinking that goes against basic science. And that's the dilemma we face. That's why I am convinced that we need to develop the technology to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Scrubbing, yeah, somehow or another.
And that's going to involve some choices that people are uncomfortable with.
Yeah, you make a good point in the book talking about you say you don't believe there is a no risk option here.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the curse of magical thinking, and I hold Al Gore significantly responsible for this when he said in 2008, if we only just try, we can have a fully fossil-free economy in 8 years. I hold that kind of magical thinking of deceiving people into thinking that we don't face that we don't have a risk-free choice.
Yeah.
And I think that's a terrible disservice to public debate about this issue. Mm-hmm. Even if you bracket people who are climate change deniers and look at people who understand there is a problem, the prevalence of this sort of thinking of what I call magical thinking about a no-cost alternative really does a disservice. I'll give you one example right now. Mm-hmm. People think, well, we could get rid of cars if only we wanted to. We could get rid of cars and have everyone drive electric cars. Well, you have to produce the electricity for the electric cars. 40% of electricity generated worldwide today is by fossil fuel burning. Mm-hmm. So if I waved a magical wand and got all of the cars that burn gasoline to be replaced by electrical cars, all of that would be generated, 40% of that would be generated with fossil fuel burning in electrical plants.
Oh, most of Alberta, I don't remember the number, 70 or 80% of Alberta is coal electricity.
Well, there you have it.
Yeah, which is the worst of the carbon emitters.
When you burn electricity, when you produce electricity in a power plant and then ship it down a power line and store it in a battery to fuel a car, you're losing a tremendous amount of electricity in that process. It's a very inefficient way of transferring energy. The longer the power line, the greater the loss. So these are not easy choices. We do have to eventually shift to a fossil-free mode of transportation, but it can't be done right away.
Mm-hmm. Do you see all of this, all of these issues that we have, and the idea in society that there is a risk-free alternative to becoming, climate positive or becoming green or whatever, however you want to put it? Do you see that the fact that society seems to think that or is waiting for that option? Do you think it's reasonable to blame that on this romantic concept of nature?
I think that has a great deal to do with it, because I think people always hold in the back of the mind that there is a natural way we could live that would solve the problem. And I think this is very much what I call a first world discourse that frames debates about climate. There was a program on television a few years ago that Bill McKibben writes about some people who are filmed as though they are living on the frontier. It's called Frontier. And of course, they're living on a make-believe frontier with, an ambulance hiding in the woods ready to take them to a hospital if they get sick, and medicine being provided and food being provided in case they need it. The calculus of what we can do when we think about climate change from the point of view of privilege in which we have excess wealth distorts the choices that face the 6.5 billion people in the world out of 7.8 billion who don't have excess wealth. It's easy for me to say, I'll trade my 2 cars for 1 car, or I'll give up my 1 car and walk 5 blocks to get the bus. But that's not a choice that most people have in the world.
Right.
And in fact, as I write, for poor people in the world, if there is no choice of a fossil-free economy, the choice between growing their household wealth, even at the cost of risking climate change many generations down the road, may be rational if increasing their household wealth improves the chances of their own children surviving to reproduce.
Of course, you can't expect someone to have some kind of moralistic view of society and what we should do as citizens if they can't feed their children.
Well, and it may be in their rational interest to feed their children for to guarantee future generations of children.
Mm.
Part of the problem, I think, that also informs this discourse, as opposed to magical thinking, is a self-interest that we don't really want to talk about. I mean, the problem of climate is that the costs have to be borne by us, and the long-term benefit kicks in many generations down the road. I mean, I have children and grandchildren. My grandchildren are going to be marginally affected by climate change, but the real effects of it are going to be for their grandchildren. And that's too far away for me to think about. But more importantly, it's far too far for a politician to think about. Politicians are responding to the short-time horizon of voter interest.
Every 4 years, yeah.
And so the horizon of concern for a politician is far shorter than where the impact of climate change begins to engage. That's why I tell people, there's very little you can do that's meaningful in your personal life that makes a difference. I mean, if it makes you feel better, do it, but it's not going to radically transform the situation. What's going to radically transform the situation is if and only if collectively people demand of their politicians collective action by the political classes globally to address this problem. And it's only when politicians hear the electorate is demanding we do this that they will see it as in their self-interest to do it.
Mm-hmm. No, that totally makes sense. It's frustrating that as human beings, at least in Western society, but I would say probably globally, we're terrible at delaying gratification. We just think the future just seems like this thing that is not our problem.
Well, it isn't. I mean, that's maybe. I'm not quite. I mean, yes, delayed gratification, but this is delayed gratification. It's not delayed gratification. We're never going to get the gratification of it personally.
Yes.
I mean, there is this. I think about this a lot. If as a forester, there is this idea that one generation cuts down trees, they plant a tree, and they know that tree won't be available for 2 generations. So there is this intergenerational compact that takes place in proper management of forests. But I think to some extent that assumes a society in which there's interconnection between generations and continuity of the population that settles there. The more we are individuals and alienated from our communities, the harder it is to engage in behavior that is not selfish, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It brings up the point of you're talking about we come to nature with expectations or with preferences and that kind of thing, and we kind of assume that future generations will care about the things that we care about, and it's an interesting, just for lack of a better word, an interesting assumption to assume that future generations will care about the same things we do.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's you talk about. It goes back to the concept of like the curating versus the preserving of nature and that kind of thing, and how do we draw that line again, right? How do we find the place that is quote unquote the right place to be? How do we find the balance between having quote unquote nature and having successful human society and that kind of thing? I don't even know where to go with these, because I feel like every time I pose a question, I could think of 7 different answers to that question as well, and it just seems like it's never ending.
Well, I think part of the problem is, again, we're playing or thinking with distinctions that we haven't fully examined. I mean, I'll give you an example. Right. We privilege status quo species over species that, as it were, would evolve or would likely evolve if some of the current species left the stage. That's what natural selection and mutation teaches us. But when we privilege the status quo, we're selective. If we could get rid of cockroaches, we'd probably vote to get rid of them. I mean, we're very selective in what species we like and what species we don't like. And so we're inconsistent. Well, what we do is we hide the fact that all of this is driven by anthropogenic interest, by self-interest, with high-blown discussions of nature. But we actually we don't really examine it. I mean, 99% of species that have existed since life evolved on Earth have gone extinct.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't really embrace and understand the implication of the degree to which radical change is ongoing, in part because the timescale of our life is so short compared to the timescale of life as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's certainly true that we are on course to cause the extinction of 80% of species that currently exist on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Because of
climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll be the first to say that's a tragedy. But if you're a philosopher, you'll ask, well, in what sense is it a tragedy? Who's it a tragedy for? It's a tragedy for us because of the way in which we value nature. Is it a tragedy for nature? Well, nature doesn't have wants, and nature doesn't care about what goes extinct. Nature couldn't care if all life goes extinct. So we only really have ourselves to think about and our relationship to nature. One of the things I struggle a lot in the 9th chapter of the book is I would love to generate an argument that we have a duty to nature, and other philosophers have tried to do that, I think very unsuccessfully. And I come to the conclusion in that chapter that this is a hopeless enterprise. But what is a plausible enterprise is to encourage an attitude of respect for nature in the face of feeling humility to nature. And what I think being in nature does is trigger those feelings. And rather than, as a philosopher, trying to think an argument about why we have a duty to nature, I think it's a good thing if we put ourselves in a place where we experience our smallness. And in experiencing our smallness, that produces an attitude of humility. And an attitude of humility produces an inclination to tread carefully in nature, as Thoreau puts it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think desecrating nature, which I talk about in the first chapter where I talk about people who litter in nature. I think desecrating nature is a terrible thing to do. But again, I don't think it's terrible to nature. I don't think it's terrible for us, as it were, collectively.
For our perception of nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, this brought up a thought in me just as you were talking there. There's a quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it was something about, I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson. It doesn't matter. But he was talking about the meaning of life and all this kind of thing, and he came to the conclusion that we are, in fact, one way. In fact, we may be the only way in which the universe knows itself. Right? It's saying that like we are all star stuff in the end. We all started from the Big Bang. We all started as particles, as whatever in the air, and we congregated into somehow through evolution and through time and through entropy, we turned into this living, thinking, conscious being that is able to understand itself. And in one way, that in and of itself is beautiful in the meaning of life, and that we are ourselves star stuff that are able to understand. We are the universe understanding itself. And in that, when you apply that concept to the idea of nature, it's almost like nature does have value because we say it does. Right?
You're a natural Buddhist here. You're going for, we're part of nature and we're the thinking part of nature. Yeah. We can do. I mean, yes. If you,
scientifically, we are, right? Like,
you can. Yes, except
you can disagree with me. It's fine.
No. Except there are billions of other civilizations in the universe as well, and I mean that seriously. If you take the number of planets in the universe, and I mean it's a matter of probability that there are civilizations with thinking beings all over the universe. We just can't, because there are so many sources, so many planets in the universe of different varieties. It's just we can't communicate with them realistically because of the distance they are from us.
Exactly.
But yes, I have thought about this kind of Buddhist take and thought that, I have one chapter in the book where I talk about a different model of biology that fits all of the facts of biology, which is instead of thinking about groups of individuals and different species, think about life as one organism. It has a beginning when life starts on the world, and it'll have an end when life goes extinct on the world, when the sun gives out or long before, given what we do.
Yeah.
And we are all part of this one individual. We're spatially separated, but we're simply one organism that has a beginning and that has an end. And that organism has different expressions of parts of it that just happen not to be connected to each other. And you can fit all of the laws, all of the empirical facts about biology onto that model instead of the model that talks about different species. And philosophically, the concept of different species is highly problematic. I think it's a category we impose on nature to try and make sense of generalizations about nature. And if we think of life as one individual of which we are a part, it's possible to sort of project the notion of self-interest beyond the confines of our own body onto other parts of nature of which we are a part. So that's in the same tradition, I think, of this kind of Buddhist notion that you're indicating an attraction to.
Right. Yeah. I guess, like I said, this is my first endeavor in going this deep into the concept. Right. I think I scratched the surface of it.
You're doing well.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.
So I want to explore that a little further. Like you talk about, I think you said something in the book around the value of nature is dependent on our interpretation of what is valuable or our interpretation of what is important. So how do we know if our imposed value on nature is, again, I don't think you're going to like this word, but like right or good or, you know what I mean?
Well,
beneficial.
let's first put in a proviso. I said, unless you believe in God, that's the case. I'm an atheist. If I had a God, Darwin would be my God. But so if you have a belief in God, then you've got an answer to all of these questions. It's if you're stuck being an atheist that you don't have this question. I mean, you face this question rather. And let's also make the proviso. I'm not necessarily saying that human beings are the only source of value. If it turns out that in the end, chimpanzees and dolphins are in fact sentient creatures, then they're also a source of value. And I have a long discussion about, how we can think about that. And I'm not close to the possibility of it. I think that there are particular challenges to making the case, but I think it's possible to make the case for some creatures. So, but let's, for the purpose of discussion, simply say human beings are the only sentient beings on Earth, and that therefore we are the source of value. Then you pose the question, what's the right value? I think that's a surprisingly problematic question from a philosophical point of view. I don't know how to say, why is honesty the right value? Well, if I was speaking from a religious point of view, I could give you an answer, but from a philosophical point of view, it's surprisingly difficult to do it. I mean, my own answer, which doesn't satisfy a lot of other philosophers, is to say there are certain kinds of values that promote general welfare. These, again, are very is a very human-centered analysis. But there are certain kinds of values that promote the collective well-being of all of the things that have moral standing. And so if cows and dolphins and chimpanzees have moral standing, then we're talking about promoting their collective welfare as well. So we want to seek a set of values that maximize well-being or welfare of the parts of the world that have moral interests. Let me just say one thing about that so I don't leave your listeners flummoxed. I mean, I used to tell my students, imagine you're a chair and imagine, how awful it is to be sat on by smelly people all day. That's what it is to have interests, a point of view. And then they'd say, oh, yeah. And then it'd say, but wait a minute. If you were a chair, you wouldn't have interests. Chairs don't have a point of view. You're illicitly projecting into a chair a human being that's shaped as a chair being sat on. So that doesn't really answer the question. The problem
Right.
is, I think most things like, stones and chairs don't have a point of view. They don't care how they're treated. Now, some things like COVID viruses care in a biological sense. They want to reproduce. But that's not the notion of interest that's relevant here. COVID virus doesn't care if it goes extinct. I mean, it's not like the viruses are not huddling together crying saying we're getting driven to extinction. They have a biological interest in reproduction. But that's not the relevant notion of interest that's in play here. What's a relevant notion of interest in play here is that you have, in some sense, the capacity to have a point of view and to care about how you're treated. And in order to do that, you have to have a lot upstairs. Worms wiggle when they're cut in half like they're in pain, but they're not in pain because they don't have the brains to be in pain. They simply have a nerve that's stimulated that reacts directly. And when you think they're in pain, it's because you're imagining how you would feel if you were cut in half, but you're not a worm.
Right. It's interesting. I just had a thought of when we start going down these philosophical routes. I imagine that some people, and I'm sure you've come across this, some naysayers or some people who believe that philosophy might not be a useful tool, they would probably say, well, this is just an exercise in futility because we just continue to go around in circles and never really come to an answer. And I don't think that's true. Personally, I think there's value in forcing us to analyze our assumptions and recognize them in a different way, because I think it provides better perspective or more comprehensive perspective. But did you come across that negative view of philosophy often? And what do you say to people when you come across that, if you do?
Well, I'm not sure how much I come across it. I mean, students would not take my classes unless they had some antecedent interest. They weren't forced to take my classes, as it were. But yeah, I mean, I do. Look, I think about some problems that are the same problems that Plato was thinking about over more than 2,000 years. And so it's legitimate to say, wait a minute, you're still thinking about the same problem? If you haven't solved it in, over 2,000 years, maybe it's time to move on to something else. So I think there is a legitimate concern in that. We began this conversation talking about the role in philosophy as it were, a process role. We clarify the assumptions people are taking for granted to enable them to have discourse with each other that clarifies what's at stake by placing the assumptions as open to question themselves. And I think that's very important to do. Another thing you can do in philosophy, which I think settles the question, is what I used to call a jujitsu move. You can concede the assumptions that your opponent is making and show that you can get to the exact opposite conclusion. The most famous example of this in philosophy in the 20th century was an argument in defense of abortion. Most people who oppose abortion say the fetus is a person and assume that's the end of the argument. But in one of the most famous arguments in papers in contemporary moral philosophy, Judith Jarvis Thomson, who just died, argued even if the fetus is a person, that doesn't mean that you're not justified in having an abortion under certain circumstances. Because just because someone is a person inside your body doesn't mean that you have no rights to how you deal with your body. And people can read that article they want. It's called in defense of abortion. So right. I do think philosophy can do that, but I also think that it's not accurate to say philosophy never settles questions. When we show in a philosophical argument that there's a contradiction where you have two inconsistent statements with each other in your argument, we're showing that your argument cannot go through, and so that does settle the question about that argument. So I do think that there's plenty for us to do.
Absolutely. No, for sure. It's I was just interested because I feel like there's probably a lot of people that you probably wouldn't come across, right? Same as I don't come across a lot of people that are super anti-forestry or whatever, right? Because it's just not my circle. But yeah, it can be a hard or a difficult, I should say. The philosophical way of thinking can be a difficult way of approaching life, right? Because I feel you say in the book a few times, like I'm a cynic, I'm a skeptic, and I feel some people might shy away from that way of thinking about life just because they don't want to, right? They want to be happy and live a happy and good life kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fine. They can pay me to do that work for them. I mean, look, again, just to go back to something we talked about before, I'm currently working on a book about risk, and I'm thinking about the notion of catastrophic risk with low or unknown probabilities. And I think we have very poorly worked out thinking about how to think about risk under these circumstances. We know how to think about risk when it comes to common garden events like smoking or working seatbelts because we have repeated events with many different instances and we can generalize over them from the data. But for one-off events where we don't have a history and where the consequences are potentially extremely catastrophic and probability is small or unknown, we don't have a good way of dealing with that. And one of the features about science is that science can never eliminate risk altogether. So you always have the potential of catastrophic outcomes lurking as a possibility. And so the question is, what stance should you take not as just as an individual, but what stance should you take from the point of view of public policy?
Yes.
And that's a question that calls for both conceptual thinking and also mathematical thinking. It's not a purely philosophical question, but it's partly a philosophical question. And I think, it's the question that began to face us in the 20th century with the development of nuclear weapons, because for the first time we had the capacity to destroy all life. Heretofore, before that, when we engaged in risky behavior, either individually or more importantly as a society, the consequences of what we could do were much more limited. But now we face this possibility, and climate change is a similar situation. I mean, the so-called Venus scenario suggests that if we reached a certain level of parts per million, we're currently at 415, I think, or 417. If we reach 900, which was the parts in the projection of business as usual about 10 years ago, we get into the territory where there's a non-zero probability of a runaway strategy in which over thousands of years the oceans could boil away. And we end up with a planet like Venus. Now, the probability of that is vanishingly small. But multiply that probability by the outcome, and you still end up with an outcome that you surely don't want.
Right. Yeah. We're definitely slow to move on that stance. And although it's like dealing with social issues, right? Like social issues, they tend to only change as generations change. It takes a generation for a new group of marginalized people to get the rights that they wanted. And it seems to be the same with climate change, although we really don't have the time.
No, we don't.
to let that happen.
No, you're right. We don't have the time. And we have squandered about 40 years, because it was in the 1980s, there were people already writing with concern about the climate situation. So we've pissed away over 40 years about this.
Yeah. And I feel a need to address the fact that I guess that was kind of a weird way for me to put it, because I'm sure the marginalized groups feel like they don't have time either. So I don't want to say that doesn't matter. I'm just, in the context of climate change,
right,
there's no time for that to happen. So yeah, you seem, obviously you have a really complicated and nuanced perspective on the human relationship with nature. You've spent a significant amount of time analyzing it and trying to come to some conclusions. And I mean, in the book, you come across, you have emotional connection to it. You're emotionally moved by it. Like you spoke at the end of the book about you were moved to tears by, or not the end of the book, I think it was the middle, moved to tears by a scene. And you also reject the idea of it needing to be protected, but you also want to see it exist for future generations. You see us as a part of nature, but you also recognize the need for us to use nature to survive. So it's if you had to summarize, this is you're not going to like this either, because I'm asking you to take something incredibly complicated and turn it into something quick. But if you had to summarize in a couple of sentences or a few minutes, whatever, however long you want to talk, if you want to take 15, that's fine. If you had to summarize in a couple of sentences what you think the ideal relationship to nature should be, what would you say? And let's come from the point of we want humans to exist, we want nature to exist, we want to have some kind of sustainable balance.
Let me just put in one rider before I answer that question. It's not that I think that nature ought not to be protected. I think the notion of protecting nature needs to be examined, and the way in which we protect nature needs to be examined.
Right.
So, to the challenge you've posed, I think that there is an idea, again, to go back to my current assumption of risk and steer away from the moral, in which, from a sort of risk point of view, the best course of action for us is to leave the world no worse off than we find it. And the reason I say that is that, I entertain the idea in the book, suppose we could curate nature as we wanted and allow certain species that we don't like cockroaches, to go extinct. We really don't know what the knock-on consequences that would be for ecosystems. And so it's very hard for us to act planfully because of limitations on our knowledge. Therefore, the safest thing to do is to be extremely cautious in our interventions. Now, I'm not suggesting that I embrace what's known as the precautionary principle. Don't make any change unless you can be sure that the change will have no bad consequences whatsoever. I'm not arguing for anything that extreme, and I think that's an incoherent theory. But I do think that a principle that we should tread lightly and tread carefully is the right kind of principle of caution that we should approach, because things could be a lot worse than they are, as it were. So that's my advice, and that's why I think the strongest thing we can do is to reduce our presence in nature. Our distortive effect on nature by our sheer numbers is potentially destructive in the consequences it might have that we might not be happy about, and therefore we should be cautious about that. So the lesson is, have fewer babies.
Yeah. I got one. I'll go get a vasectomy after work here today. But no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that summarization. I think that's hard to argue with, right? Like, just let's be thoughtful. Let's be cautious. Let's not be afraid to act out of fear of doing something wrong, but let's just make sure we've thought things through in a reasonable way before we do so. And I think it's hard to argue with. And people would argue about how much thinking we should do, like you said, the precautionary principle, and don't want to be paralyzed by fear. But I like that approach. I think that's good. I think it includes my general idea of nature as well. Okay. So that's good. Thank you very much. So in the last paragraph of your book, you start talking about you have an open discussion about the importance or the relevance of emotion and moral character when thinking about these things. So after all of that, the whole book, all of this cynicism, rational thought, all this kind of thing, in the end, you kind of put an apostrophe or an exclamation point on the end, or maybe I don't know, something on the end saying but emotions matter. What role do you think emotions have? Because again, we go back to that idea of romanticism and all that kind of thing. So what role does emotion have when it comes to us making decisions about our interaction and management or relationship with nature?
Yes. I think this is an important topic, and I'm aware when I put that towards the end of the book that someone may say, "Well, why did you have me do all this thinking if emotions in play?"
I like it. I personally love it.
It's okay. We live with many illusions about not just our relationship to nature and what nature is, but ourselves. And one of the illusions we have about ourselves is that our conscious brain is in control of all of ourselves. And of course, our conscious brain is only a very, very small part of our brain. Most of our brain is functioning below the level of consciousness. And I think there's some very interesting research by an American psychologist named John Haidt, Haidt, who's now at New York University, and he puts people in imaging machines and then asks them questions or gives them pictures to react to, and then visualizes their brain on his machines. And he's able to see how certain sections of their brains are reacting to stimuli before other sections. I mean, if you think about this from the point of view of reflex reactions, you're walking through the forest and you suddenly see something that looks like a snake. You jump back reflexively, and then you look carefully and you see it's actually a bent stick. Well, that reflexive reaction of jumping back operates at a cognitive level below consciousness. It's like touching a hot thing and pulling your hand back. You don't realize it's hot. You've pulled your hand back before you realize it's hot. So stimuli reach certain sections of the brain, the lower brain, before they reach higher sections of the brain, the conscious brain. And what Haidt has shown is that often we're reacting with what, crudely speaking, are emotional reactions. We are reacting with emotional centers of the brain before the cognitive areas of the brain cut in. And that gives rise to the idea that a lot of what we're thinking about is an ex post facto, an after the fact rationalization of something we've already thought about. You see that a lot when you expose people to pictures and ask people, what do you think of this person? Is this person trustworthy, let's say? And you can see that people are first reacting emotionally without realizing it in the emotional centers of their brain. And then what they do is give a rationalization for something they've already concluded, as it were, from an emotional point of view.
Right.
So I think a lot of what we are doing, unless we're very careful, when we think a lot, is a rationalization of something we've arrived at emotionally. And I think we need to face that consequence and look at it. Now, there's another feature to this as well. Another illusion we live under is that the content of our thinking is all a matter of our individual matter. We blind ourselves to the degree to which we are social beings in the cognitive content of our minds. Our attitudes are determined much more socially than we like to believe. And so I think the book ends with two ideas. One is that we should pay more attention to the emotions, and hopefully nature allows us to react with emotions that can inculcate humility and respect. But the other thing is that we shouldn't view this challenge as a matter of individuals. We should view it at a cultural level. And I think when I look at countries like the United States, I won't speak for Canada, and compare it to other countries, I think our hyper-individualism makes it very difficult to introduce culturally sets of values that will trickle down to the population as a whole. Other countries are much more successful in doing that. And I think, the quest for an attitude of respect for nature, quote, respect for nature, or humility in the face of nature, not acting destructively of nature, if only because we think it's the right action in terms of risk to tread lightly in nature, is really, I think, better understood as a cultural project, not an individual project. And I don't think, again, in the United States, we have the cultural mechanisms to be able to do that. The polarization of cultural discourse is so fervent that it's impossible to arrive at a consensus about anything like that. And I think in Canada, you have a better chance to do that.
I would say we seem to be a slightly less individualistic in that way. We seem to have, but there's still a bit of that. We're not as well off as I would hope we were. And I think COVID-19 is a perfect example of pointing to which countries were more able to put aside their individual issues to take up the greater good, right? So I think you can probably look at the numbers that way, and you can probably figure out where people lie or where countries lie. So no, we definitely have that issue here. Maybe not to the extent the States does, but we do. Yeah.
Well, I have this fantasy that, all nations should simply go on their knees to the Prime Minister of Denmark or New Zealand and say, why don't you just take over the world? You're so reasonable. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, she's so reasonable. The New Zealanders seem to be so reasonable. Why don't we just let them rule the world?
Yeah. Yeah, we just need a benevolent dictator.
Yeah,
if only we could guarantee that over time.
Exactly.
Yeah, I really appreciated the last paragraph, and it was just the last little bit there where you spoke about the importance of emotion, because it's something that I've come to realize throughout the course of all my podcasts is that I talk a lot about science. We talk a lot about the facts and what the evidence points to in science. And only in the last couple seasons have I started to recognize the value and the importance of emotion. It was almost like, I've said this a few times, it was almost like I was almost a scientific zealot for a little while, and that I was kind of negating emotion for fact. And over the course of the last couple of years, I've realized that you don't have full comprehension of a subject or full understanding of it, full perspective without the emotion, right? And that although the facts are needed, the science is needed, the evidence is needed, the emotion allows us to make sense of those facts and apply them in a real way that is relevant to society. And so I appreciated that conclusion at the end. I didn't think it was contradictory to the book. I thought it actually complemented it very well. And so, yeah, I was happy to see that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Even though I'm not someone whose opinion you should be seeking approval you should be seeking. So it's fine.
I'm happy to seek everyone's approval.
Yeah. Okay. So finally, I have one final question for you. After analyzing our relationship with nature, I think I know the answer, but I'll ask you anyways. What worries you? And then to finish it off, what gives you hope?
Well, to answer the second question, I mean, again, I'm a half empty glass kind of guy. I'm a pessimist and a skeptic. So I'm not sure that I have hope about anything.
Crap! That's not good. They're supposed to end on a good note, but I guess we'll end on doom and gloom.
Look, I'm largely pessimistic, but human beings are an inventive species. But I do think that if there is going to be a hope for solution, it has to be our willingness to embrace technical approaches of this kind and pay the costs involved, which are going to be a significant portion of global GDP. Mm-hmm. The sooner we do that, the better in terms of saving other species, which, even if it doesn't matter to those species, matters to us in terms of our appreciation of the variety of life.
Mm-hmm. So be thoughtful, be creative. Don't be afraid to make a decision and hope for the best.
Okay.
I have to try and come up with some kind of takeaways, right? Well, I appreciate you coming on, Martin. Your book, Thinking While Walking, Reflections on the Pacific Crest Trail. Really enjoyed it. Like I said, it was a new path for me, and I find myself, I expect that I'm going to be seeking out more philosophical stuff in the future, just because it is so challenging of our perspectives and our assumptions, and I'm finding I enjoy that. I like it. So thank you for introducing me to it. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for this conversation. It was wonderful. I really appreciate it. And I hope the book flies off the shelves.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks a lot for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. My head's spinning. I don't know about yours, but his book and Martin himself have inspired me to do more of this, more challenging of my own perspective, more challenging of my assumptions. And definitely reach out, get his book, Thinking While Walking, Reflections on the Pacific Crest Trail. So good. You're going to love it. Definitely forces you to think differently than you used to, which I love. So thanks a lot, Martin. I appreciate you coming on. This is great. And thanks a lot, everyone, for listening. Check out the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff. Share it with a friend. All that helps. Rate and review. Please, please, please rate and review. Really, really helpful. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll catch you next time. Take it easy.